Okay, so the topic for today is why I am an anarchist. And you see, now, even just to mention that topic is enough to want Venerable Akaliko to want to run away and leave me, you see. So this is obviously something which... But I got a very good lesson in this and what it means to me to be an anarchist, actually just this afternoon, just before the talk. And I just went for a little bit of a walk this afternoon, and I came back, and just outside in the flats, some of the neighbours' kids were playing. And these kids were maybe like 8 or something like that. And two boys and a girl, and they were playing around, and just going to walk past and said hi. And then I was walking off. One of them said, "A monk's bad. A monk's bad." I said, "That's curious, isn't it?" So I turned around and thought, I said, "Sorry, what do you mean, a monk's bad?" And he said, "Well," I was just talking to the three of them, and he said, sometimes I was talking to, I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." And he said, when they said that, I said to them, "Why? What's the reason?" And they didn't tell me any reason. And then the little girl who was there said, she said, "We're all sisters, we're all brothers, and we should all respect each other." And I'm like, do they have like adoption or something like that? And I was like, that's so incredible. Huh? We're all sisters and all brothers. Why should we be treating each other that way? Why should we be acting in that kind of way? And so for me, if you ask, why am I an anarchist, then that's the simple reason why. Because we are all sisters and brothers, and because that's how we should relate to each other. Our relationships should be on the basis of respect and the basis of love, and not on the basis of power and threats and all of those kinds of things. Now, this is a very kind of personal thing, It's my own personality and who I am. But I just have this very kind of instinctual distrust, almost like a loathing or detestation of like power and what it does to people and what it does to people in relationship with each other. I should add as a caveat here that I am by no means an expert on anarchism or anything vaguely like that. I have a little bit of a vague knowledge of the general outlines of the philosophy, but I couldn't tell you who the great anarchist thinkers are, or what the books to read are, or what the different schools are, or anything like that. But I just have some kind of idea of the basic philosophy. Of course, it's something that's come up a lot recently, and why I wanted to talk about it was because we're finding that it's now become a sort of a fairly regular bogeyman in a lot of the sort of law and order statements by politicians, especially in the United States, where they're talking about the anarchists and terrorists and so on, as if being an anarchist is such a terrible thing, and that this kind of image of anarchists as sort of running around the streets, blowing things up and so on, as if this kind of lawless thing is kind of it's a standard trope. And to be sure, there have been violent anarchists in the past, and there have been anarchists who've committed terrorist acts in the past. Not that hasn't happened; it has happened. But all of the anarchists that I've known in my life have been pacifists, and I think I really don't know the statistics. Like I said, I'm not an expert by any means, but as far as I know, most anarchists are pacifist and abhor violence and would only think of using violence as a very kind of last resort. In fact, the critique of the state-sponsored use of violence is one of the core tenets of anarchism. So as far as I understand it, the basic idea of anarchism is that it's better to organize people in terms of networks and connections rather than in terms of top-down power-based hierarchies. This is the basic idea. And so, we already have those networked connections amongst our family, amongst our friends, and so on and so forth. And so the idea is that that's a better way of organizing ourselves. To give a bit of historical perspective, if we think about the way that the universe is constructed from a theistic point of view. So a theistic point of view says that there is a God who sits in the heaven and orders everything that happens. If a leaf falls off a tree, the God says, leaf fall off the tree. If a little baby cries, the God says, little baby cry. And whatever's happening, God makes it so. And God works through various agents, the gods, the angels, and then the God's representatives on earth, the bishops and priests, and then down to the kings and lords and so on. And this is kind of thing which goes sort of down and down and down, and power is exercised from the top to the bottom. And this is a kind of a hierarchical structure. Now, the word hierarchy, interestingly enough, means rulership by priests. Okay, so the prefix higher is a word for a priest, and archy is the idea of rulership. So hierarchy is, literal meaning of it is a rulership of priests, but the applied meaning or the contextual meaning is that kind of top-down idea of how the universe works. And in societies that are dominated by a theistic idea, then there's that kind of top-down hierarchy accords with the conception of how the natural world is. And so in other words, the social order mirrors the natural order. And this is how the people in those positions within that hierarchy will justify their position. We have more power because we are in this position of hierarchy, which is part of the natural order as ordained by God. Now, it need not be God. There might be other ways of justifying it, but that's just one familiar way of doing it. It's a curious thing. If we look in religions and spiritual systems, philosophies of any kind, that they will, as far as I'm aware, invariably begin and found themselves on some conception of the equality and the dignity and the worth and the value of each human being. Whether it's sentient beings, right? In Buddhism, we have all sentient beings, so that's a kind of a bit not so clear in many philosophies as it is in Buddhism, but certainly as far as human beings is concerned, then, from a Christian point of view, then, all humans have a spark in them of God, and they are made in the image of God, and they have that worth as being children of God. In a Brahmanical conception, for example, Hindu conception, all creatures were created by Brahma and spring from the voice of Brahma. In what other philosophies are? Oh, so in the other aspect of like a Hindu view of a non-dual view is that we're not just created from Brahma or created from God, but we are in fact ourselves God, and that we merely have forgotten that or hidden that from ourselves. If say a secularist view, or if you like a Western Enlightenment view, would argue that we all have innate human rights, and we have that dignity because we have those innate human rights. A Jain, to pick another example, would say that all sentient beings, and indeed for the Jains even inanimate nature, has a jiva or a soul whose essence is eternal and omnipotent, and omniscient. So we all share that in common with each other. And so each philosophy, each of these ways of viewing the world, and I'm sure many others, not meaning to exclude anyone here, they all have these conceptions of the equality of all human beings. And all of those conceptions of things, I mean, we can discuss the particular philosophical details of that, but they're all quite beautiful conceptions in their own way. There's something dignified and something quite uplifting about all of those views of the world, and they can, all of them, provide a basis for uplifting morality and uplifting values. From a Buddhist point of view, of course, then we hold that each creature, each sentient being, is of value because of their sentience, because of their consciousness, because they can suffer and feel pain and also feel pleasure and feel happiness. Because the worth of each creature is valuable in and of itself, and also each creature has the potential for enlightenment. Each creature is related to us through countless past lives, and we should treat each creature with respect and dignity, as our 8-year-old sister told us. Now, having started with that beautiful conception of the equality of beings, every system in the world, including Buddhism, then proceeds to say, well, but all creatures are equal, but as George Orwell so famously said, some animals are more equal than others. And so we then proceed to build hierarchies that differentiate and distinguish, and that place some above others, and that make some kind of justification for giving more power to some and less power to others. And curiously enough, maybe it's just a coincidence, but it does seem rather striking that those people who are in charge and the authorities over the interpretation of the sacred texts very often seem to be the ones who find in those texts some justification for their own superior position in the hierarchy. And so curious, isn't it? Right? I don't know. It's not common to find somebody who would look into an ancient sacred text and say, "Oh, well, that therefore puts me down at the bottom of it." So that construction with the top-down power has become entrenched in the social systems that we see around the world, most of the social systems, and especially the larger organizations like nations and these kinds of things. Right? But one of the things that happened around, say, 400 or 500 years ago, especially from Europe, the period we call the Renaissance, and then especially the Enlightenment, was that there was a renewed emphasis given to this equality of all, and an increased questioning of that top-down hierarchical power structure. Now, that questioning happened in a radical way in the natural sciences. And when, through the works of Copernicus and Galileo, Newton, and then a whole series of other scientists, the physical idea that God was determining how the stars circled in the sky and how the animals came to be and all of these kinds of things, all of that became completely swept away. And the idea that nature runs according to top-down hierarchies where people are ordered to do something for some purpose was completely dispensed with. And instead, we discovered a much more powerful way of understanding nature in terms of systems and networks and interrelationships. So we can see that even an incredibly complex system like a forest or an ocean, or even just little parts of it, like a particular, like a bush with the community, with its own complex biology and the communities of insects that live there and the animals that feed off it, even something like that, all works based on networks and feedback without some overarching controller to tell it what to do. And so there were attempts, and of course, you know, the whole rise of democracy in the West and later throughout the world was a reflection of that, and was a partial attempt to say, well, let's apply those same methods and ideas to the cultural sphere and the social sphere. If we can no longer justify the hierarchy, the idea that there are certain people who are in that position of power because of some natural law. If we can no longer justify that, then let us listen to what the people say and let us introduce that. Now, one of the problems with that was that it's rather curious. If you look at it like before we had democracy, the lords ruled everything, right? So essentially the rich landowners ruled everything. Of course, now we have democracy. Who's in the parliament? Rich landowners. It's curious, isn't it? It's still extremely rare to find anyone who's ruling things, who hasn't been to, in England, been to Eton or been a Rhodes Scholar or been to one of the major universities, or who hasn't come from a rich family, who doesn't come from a landowning family. It hasn't, it's changed. I don't want to say that it hasn't changed. I'm just saying that it's still a long way to go. We don't find very many homeless people sitting in Parliament. We don't find very many, blue-collar workers sitting in Parliament. The ability of us to govern ourselves as equals has only just started. And so an anarchist would say, well, why can't we apply those same principles of networking that nature uses, we see throughout nature? Why can't we apply those same principles to social organization? Now, clearly, there's something to that idea, right? Clearly, it's possible to do that in small ways, and people do that all the time, right? We constantly do that with our friends or with little groups and things like that, and we can organize ourselves in a little group and get something done and do something, small or something big, and we don't need a big, complicated leadership structure or hierarchy to do that. So clearly, there's something to this idea. Yet, it still seems that as things become bigger, as things become more power-orientated, and there's more money, more real estate involved, then we seem to revert back to these more hierarchical structures. One of the things that really surprised me and quite delighted me when I came to Buddhism and I began to study as a monk the Vinaya was how much the Vinaya was in fact an anarchist constitution. So anarchy doesn't mean chaos. It doesn't mean disorder. It doesn't mean just do whatever you want. What anarchy means is that we can figure out for ourselves as responsible and mature human beings what is the right way to behave. And that right way to behave should be based on our mutual agreement and consent and not by the imposition of laws from outside. And there's a few things which are generally, I think, common in anarchistic ideas. Number one is that as far as possible, things be done by consensus rather than simple majority. It's not always possible to do that, but that's the ideal, because a majority can easily become a tyranny. And it happens, it's extremely common, it's absolutely normal that a majority will tyrannize a minority. So consensus. Second thing that's important is, and I should mention these as I go. So consensus, and consensus is an absolute requirement for every procedure in the Vinaya, with certain minor exceptions. Okay, so the default way of doing any kind of Sangha procedure in the Vinaya is consensus. Every monk or every nun in that community must be present. There are procedures if a monk or nun is absent. There are procedures to get their, what we call the chanda, which is their consent for a particular procedure. There are some fairly narrowly defined exceptions, which are called yebuhu yasika, where decisions can be made according to majority, and there are procedures for doing that. But generally speaking, that's the exception. The normal case is consensus, and that's one of the principles of anarchism. Another principle of anarchism is that it's based on, as far as possible, direct democracy rather than representative democracy. So in the world that we live in, our society, we elect somebody and we say, this is what you want you to do, and we trust them to do that. And look, it's okay, right? I'm an anarchist, but I'm also a realist, right? I don't necessarily imagine, I'm not a utopianist. I don't imagine that these things are always going to work 100%. So sometimes it works okay to do that, but it's often not ideal. So in an anarchist way of functioning, everyone has to be present. And in Vinaya, this is called Sammukha Vinaya. Sammukha Vinaya literally means that every monk or nun must be present at every procedure. So there has to be presence, and there has to be consensus, two of the foundational principles of anarchism. Third foundational principle is that as far as possible, we avoid personal property. So property is held in common. Now, this is something that that is again like a reflection of a state of nature. Okay, so in a state of nature, things aren't owned by people. I don't walk along and see a tree and own that tree. I don't own the air that blows through or the insects that are buzzing. I don't own the water that falls from the sky or the birds that are singing. And ownership is something that human beings invent at a certain time in their history. And if we look in the Buddhist texts, especially Buddhist mythological texts like the Aganya Sutta, then the arisal of the idea of private property, of land ownership, was one of the defining points in the decline of human culture. That's one of those tipping points that makes you think that's where it all started to go bad. We started to get greedy. We started to say, this is mine. And once we have mine, then if you don't have enough, tough luck, this is mine. If somebody takes it from us, I'll hurt them or I'll arrest them. And so the whole idea of kind of law and jurisdiction and all of these kinds of things stems from that basic idea that we can somehow draw lines around nature and own it. And of course, it's not necessary to live that way. Aboriginal communities did not live that way. And in monasteries also, we avoid living that way so far as possible. So generally speaking, in monastic communities, we have like our private property will tend to be just like small personal things, like maybe our robes or shoes, these kinds of things. But the major things, the actual buildings, the property, and all of those things are held in common. And so this owning of things in common is another of the basic principles of an anarchist community. So that's three things: presence, consensus, and communal ownership. Another thing is a lack of coercion. So one of the basic anarchist critiques of society is that the state has arrogated to itself the right to commit violence. And anarchists will argue that there's no moral justification for that. And further, that having done so, it will inevitably lead to the corruption of the state, no matter how virtuous their motivations might be at the beginning. Once you say that representatives of the state can exert violence in ways that other people cannot, without being held accountable for that violence, then you are taking a step down a road that can end, and very often does end, in a very dark place. Now, of course, in the way that states operate, then, you know, there's a huge variation. There are places where you know, the exercise of violence is absolutely horrible, and you know, we're seeing lots of examples of that with the murder of black people in the United States, and you know, lots of other examples with that, with the treatment of the Uyghur in China or the Rohingya in Myanmar, or so many examples around the world where the state decides to act with violence on a minority or one group within it, and does so with impunity. At the same time, though, it's of course also the case that states can act relatively with responsibility and with restraint, and that we see plenty of examples of that also. So we want to be, you know, because I believe in this anarchist principle, it doesn't mean that you have to see the functioning of a state in black and white terms. You know, there still can be relatively good states and relatively less good ones, and we can encourage the good ones to be better. So that's certainly the case. But within an anarchist community, we should always try to avoid any kind of coercive justice, and particularly the perpetration of violence. Within the Sangha, justice is always with certain narrow exceptions. Justice is always dependent on the confession and the invitation of the person who has transgressed. It's not enough just to have an assumption of innocence. It's not enough just to say we need evidence to prove that that person is guilty. That person has to admit that they're guilty, and they have to request, please deal with me as is appropriate. If there's a punishment to be done, please give me that punishment. It has to come from their request. This is how far down that road of that anarchist road of consensus and lack of coercive justice that Buddhism goes. Now, of course, obviously that's not going to apply in every case. There are people who simply won't do the right thing. And even in monasteries, there are people who will take advantage of that. I remember my first friend who's an anarchist I knew in Perth they used to run an anarchist printing press and bookshop at the time in Fremantle. And he said, there was just one guy, there has to be just one, right? He would just show up at their shop and he just put his bunk down in the back of the shop and stay there. And we'd try to kick him out and say, you can't kick me out, you're anarchists, right? There has to be one always, right? And so it's really difficult to maintain this. So again, because we look to a better way of being human, doesn't mean that we can't acknowledge that there are practical realities to be dealt with, and sometimes that's not ideal. There are one or two cases we see in the suttas where for example, one case where there was a bad monk, a corrupt monk sitting in the Sangha, and the Buddha wouldn't do the Patimokkha on the Uposatha day until eventually Mahamoggallana read his mind, saw who the bad monk was, picked him up by the arm and threw him out. Now, he wasn't being violent, he wasn't punishing him or anything, but he did physically have to remove him from that space. And so within the Sangha as well, there are certain procedures and so on that we have to use to deal with recalcitrant or corrupt members of the Sangha. So those procedures are there. It's also, I think, important to acknowledge that those procedures often don't actually work, precisely because they do rely on good faith and consensus. And if there are people with bad faith, and if there is a lack of consensus, then it's really hard to actually do anything about that within the bounds provided by the Vinaya itself. And that's one of the reasons why in Buddhist nations, or in nations that are, have a large Buddhist community, then often we find that the state will intervene in some way in order to try to control the behavior of the Sangha. And again, personally, I don't like it. Right? I don't like the fact that there's a Sangha Act in Thailand and that they can make laws about monks. I don't think that's a good idea. At the same time, I do appreciate that, there is a genuine problem to be addressed. I personally would try to prefer addressing it a different way, but recognize there is an issue there that needs to be addressed. So when it comes to me and to sort of my life and my preferences as a monk, and especially when running a monastery, when I was at Santi and when different places, then I've always tried to keep these ideals and to try to manifest in the community this sense that we're all here together. In my role as a senior monk or as a leader, to try to inspire people, to educate people, to bring people together, and as far as possible to operate in consensus and without telling people what to do. I often found that in a monastery, a lot of people seemed to have the idea that it was their job to tell everybody else what to do. And they didn't like the fact that I didn't really like telling people what to do. I mean, hey, look, I don't know. Maybe it's a character flaw. Maybe I'm just an avoidant personality. I don't know. Maybe you might be completely right, but that's what works for me. I don't like to tell people what to do. I like to just be happy with people. If you want to do it that way, okay, you do it that way. Now, living within an anarchist community doesn't mean that you just let people get away with doing anything they like. It means that if you intervene, that you do that in a way which is only when necessary and only to the degree that is necessary. One of the things that we use, and which is a very useful principle of organization within the Sangha, is the appointment of Sangha officers. So what happens is that the community gets together, and then we decide, okay, we need somebody to, whatever, arrange the dana times, or we need somebody to look after the guests, or we need somebody to manage the cleaning of the buildings, or whatever the tasks may be. And so as a Sangha, we then appoint a Sangha representative, one of the members of the community, to do that job. So what that means is that it means that, like, not all of our decisions have to be done by committee. And I think this is one of the things which really can drag a community down, that we all have to sort of sit there through endless meetings figuring out every detail about when is the gate going to be opened and shut, and what books are being put in the library. And I mean, look, there are plenty of discussions like that in monasteries, I'm not going to lie. But we can certainly minimize that by appointing Sangha officers. We can give the Sangha officers policies and guidelines if need be. But once the Sangha officer is doing their job, it's the role of the community, and especially the leaders within the community, to support them in doing their job. Okay, so it's our job to when, if there are complaints and all these kinds of things, to respect the work done by the Sangha officer, to support them and not to undermine them, because they're doing a hard job. And they were given that job because the community trusted them. And it's not up to any individual to undermine them in doing their job. If that Sangha officer, if that representative of the community does something that somebody else doesn't like, then it's that person's responsibility to bring that up with the Sangha officer. Right? And if that doesn't work, then the two of them should come to the community, and then the community can discuss it and can resolve it. That's how things should work. And so when I was an abbot of the monastery, I really didn't want to be called an abbot. The first thing I said, the first meeting we had for Sunday Monastery, I said, I don't want to be called an abbot. Sort of came, it happened anyway. You don't really have much power over these things. But, I find that people would very often put me in this kind of position where, I didn't get along with somebody did this, what do I do about that, and how do I call this? And then they come to me to solve the problems. And I'm like, well, solve your own problem. I don't want to sort of be not supporting you, but if you haven't made an attempt, so the first thing I would do would be, well, have you spoken about it with them? Oh, no, I haven't. Well, make the attempt. If the attempt doesn't work, I can understand that. But if you're not even going to try, why are you coming to me to solve your problems for you? Oh, but I can't talk to them for X and Y reasons. Try anyway. So this is something that we can do to show our respect for each other as brothers and sisters. That if somebody's doing a job on behalf of the community, give them that respect to say, look, when you do this, I disagree with that for this and that reason. And then that Sangha officer then has the responsibility to listen to that. Don't just dismiss it. Don't get defensive, okay? Listen to it. It's important to listen. You may or may not agree, but at least you can listen respectfully. And if you can't agree, then you should decide among yourself, let's go to the community. And then in my position as a leader of the community, then I might be responsible for saying, okay, let's call a meeting, let's do this. And then we figure out a procedure for how to resolve that. That's how these things should work. Again, I don't want to be too idealistic. Even in a monastery, even in a spiritual community, these things often break down, and it's often hard to get them working. I know, I've been there. So I'm not, like I said, I'm not a utopian or an idealist. I'm a pragmatist. But at least we can try. At least we can ask ourselves, is there a way we can do this a little bit better? Is there a way that we can treat each other with a little bit more dignity? Is there a way that we can look at these principles of organization that the Buddha used and that the Buddha laid down for the Sangha? And if we can say, well, might those same principles apply for me in my home, in my organization, in my community group, in my Dhamma group? Is there a way that we can make sure that we keep those principles of making sure everyone's present, that we have everyone's consensus, that we have no coercive justice, that we keep property in common as far as possible, and that we respect the authority of, if we ask somebody to do a job, that we respect them in the doing of that job. So these are important organizational principles that are, I think, useful everywhere. A number of years ago, I was invited to do a talk for some corporate thing, and they wanted me to talk about mindfulness in a corporate setting. And I'm like, I've never worked in a corporate setting. How would I know anything about it? And then I realized, oh, hang on. I actually belong to the world's oldest, largest, and most successful multinational corporation, the Buddhist Sangha. And we've been around for 2,500 years. Why is that? Why is it that we've been around for 2,500 years and there's still hundreds of thousands of us? And we're all over the world. Why is that? There's something about the way that the Buddha set up the Sangha that has enabled that to persist. And of course, a lot of that is to do with the Dhamma and the power of the Dhamma. A lot of that has to do with the support of traditional Buddhist communities and all kinds of things which are part of that. It's not just one thing or the other. But a part of that, I believe, is because of the resilience and adaptability of the organizational models laid down by the Buddha, that these can be taken into so many different places, so many different cultures, so many different times, and so many different settings, and yet they can still work. And even if it is true that it's perhaps rare to find a Sangha community that completely lives by all of the things that are found in the Vinaya, nevertheless, most Sangha communities are still inspired to a certain degree by many of the things within that. And those principles of the Vinaya still inform Sangha life and give us a point of reflection and learning in so many different areas. And so this, at the end of the day, is really why I am an anarchist. I'm an anarchist because I don't see myself as being better than anybody else. I don't see myself as having particular grounds to tell anybody else what to do. I'm an anarchist because I think that the principles of anarchism are in line with the principles of the Dhamma. And I'm an anarchist because I kind of suspect that the Buddha was an anarchist.